Hi, welcome to Cash, Color, and Control, Colorado Fiscal Institute's new YouTube series, where we're going to talk with each other, with our partners, and with you all about why you should care about tax policy, if you care about economic justice, if you care about social justice, if you care about racial justice. So before we get into that, Esther, would you care to introduce who Colorado Fiscal Institute is?
Yeah, of course. So for our partners and viewers who don't know who the Colorado Fiscal Institute or CFI is, we are a statewide policy advocacy nonprofit that advances tax, budget, and economic policies that promote equity and widespread prosperity. We have been around for a while, either as a project or a full organization, advancing these policies in Colorado.
One of the things that CFI believes very strongly, and one of my first introductions to CFI, was this idea that tax justice is social justice. I remember in my interview with Kathy, our executive director, that was one of the things she said to me that really piqued my interest about this organization. And so I would love for you to just tell us how CFI came to this conclusion.
I think we, as individual folks who started CFI and have worked at CFI, I think everyone comes to tax and budget policies because we believe that, or we don't know until we're introduced to tax advocacy that is the truth, right? For those of us who work or have worked at CFI, once we understand taxes more, we understand what a pivotal role they play in creating healthy and thriving communities, and that if you care about social justice, you have to care about this underlying, more quiet arm of policy, right? I do want to take you back to 2018. The year was 2018 because it was a really important aha moment, I think, for us. We, our national partner, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, had released this really important report called the Advancing Racial Equity with State Tax Policy. And it really opened our eyes and provided us with this information and research that I don't think we had access to before, that really brought light into the hidden and dark history of taxes. And it really, hit us and allowed us to see that taxes are one of those things that also have this dark history. And the more light we can shed on it, the more we can understand why, like in Mean Girls, right? Everyone's feels victimized by Regina George. I think a big reason why today so many people feel victimized by taxes and tax policy, or feel like, how we talk about as a team all the time, that taxes, just people don't like them and they feel heavy. And I think understanding their history through that paper was a really big pivotal moment for us. It really allowed us to understand that modern tax policy and the foundation of our tax code today really has this racist history, and policies, specifically tax policies, used to further oppress Black Americans and Black Southerners specifically, but Black populations across the country. And so it really added to our understanding of modern day tax policies and the effects that they have today.
As I understand it, one of the things that we learned from this report and have come to understand even more so since then is how so many of our tax policies are actually rooted in the Reconstruction era and in all the kind of tumult and the backlash that went along with that. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so tax policy obviously has a long history before Reconstruction era, but Reconstruction era is a really pivotal moment in time because we see that it was a time, post-Reconstruction especially, was a time where states specifically used and really weaponized tax policy as a way to keep power and control in the hands of the wealthy few, and really, push further this idea of deservedness and undeservedness within our tax code. So let's do a little Civics 101. We had the Civil War. The Civil War ended. We had Emancipation Proclamation, and everything that came after that. The war ends. The Reconstruction period begins in 1865. And then after that, we have this period, just post-Reconstruction, between the 1870s and 1890s, that we see the rise of a lot of our modern day tax policies that were born in that era. And what we find historically is that during that time, there were actually a lot of gains that Black Southerners made in Southern countries. So we see, a lot of legislatures in the South were predominantly Black. Black men got the right to vote in the 1870s, and so a lot of Black Southerners got really engaged civically. They were really a part of building states and their policies, and there was a big push during that time to use taxes to invest in public services, and one of those really being our modern day education system. So much of our modern day education system, K-12 education system, and specifically using property taxes to fund schools, was really pushed by Black Southerners post Reconstruction era. And as we know, even today, so much of school funding for public education comes from local property taxes. The punchline here is that we use tax policy to invest in the programs and services that create healthy and thriving communities. And so we see that during the Reconstruction era. What people didn't realize is that free Black people did not have access to owning property, right? They were barely a few years removed from Emancipation Proclamation, the Reconstruction era. And so Black folks don't have access to owning property. Women had virtually no rights during that time as well. A lot of the property that was owned by wealthy white men. Mm-hmm. So you have the two things happening: is that most of the property that's owned is owned by white men, and it is that property that's getting taxed to fund public education for all children, including Black children and Black folks. So you can imagine white men didn't like the idea that their property was being taxed and that those tax dollars are being used to fund public services. Mm-hmm. And so we see at that time the rise and this concerted effort to use tax policy as a way to protect themselves, to protect their property, and to not have public tax dollars used to fund programs and services.
We're okay with using it to fund public services for themselves and for their own and their kids going to school, but not for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Going back to like that whole who deserves, who doesn't, right, who has access and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And this is just one very specific example. There are many, a lot, which come from the South, but also across the nation. We see things, similar policies in California, in Colorado. We'll talk, way more about that. But there are a ton of examples during that era of how states specifically decided to use tax policy as a way to keep power, money, control at the hands of the small, wealthy few.
Well, I think that's a good conversation. I think those examples are something we definitely would like to get into. If you're interested in hearing more about some of those policies that were specifically a concerted effort to drive power into the hands of a few people, come back for episode 2. We're going to be going through some of those examples and talking about just that. Is there anything you want to add to kind of put a period on this introductory episode?
We're excited. You and I nerd out about this history all the time. Yeah. So we're excited to keep talking about it. And I know the people probably want to know, are we going to talk about the bad word, Tabor? And we are. You'll just have to come back and make sure that you join us for the rest of the series.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us for Cash, Color, and Control, exploring how race, money, and power collide in the tax system. We'll see you at episode 2.
Thanks, Al.